This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Michael Holzman, author of Spies and Traitors, among other great books on espionage during World War II and the Cold War. Links to learn more about Michael Holzman and his books can be found in the show notes. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcast. These reviews really help me know what you think of the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. To learn more about the Parthenon podcast networks and great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged, James Early's Key Battles of American History, Richard Lim's This American President, and more can be found at parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies, and stories so great they should be movies on Facebook and Twitter by searching for A2Z History. You can contact me there or just send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. I thank you for joining me again, Beyond the Big Screen, and I think you're going to enjoy this one today. Thank you for joining us today again. I am very excited to be joined again by special guest Michael Holzman, author of the book Spies and Traitors, Kim Philby, James Angleton, and the Friendship and Betrayal that would shape MI6, the CIA, in the Cold War. Michael Holzman is the author of numerous books, including James Jesus Angleton, The CIA and the Craft of Intelligence, a biography of Guy Burgess, and one on Donald and Melinda McLean, as well as the novel Pax, 1934 to 1941. Today's episode is kind of a add-on to our episode when we talked about James Jesus Angleton and Kim Philby. Today, we're going to talk about another spy and traitor who affected the entire trajectory of the Cold War, scientist Klaus Fuchs. The focus of most of your works is on Cold War history, and particularly spies and espionage during the Cold War. How did you become interested in this topic?
It was more or less an accident. I drifted into it. I was interested in ideology, the way in which the ideas that usually a dominant group affect the actions of everyone within that group and everyone that's affected by it. So a very good example of how that works is these groups of people who are involved in espionage, not for money, but because of their beliefs. Kim Philby, who we talked about rather exhaustively the other day, was part of a group at Cambridge University in England in the early 1930s that joined the Communist Party because they were concerned about the way that the dominant group in Britain, in the British Empire, was accumulating enormous riches at the expense of the people who were actually producing them. I've just been reading, actually, the diaries of Henry Chips Channon, who was a member of that dominant group. He was in the society pages, as it were, of England, particularly in the 1920s, and the rather dazzling lifestyle that he led, dressing for dinner every night, going to balls constantly, moving from one castle to another. It's a very good example of how the top 2%, 1%, 1/2 of European countries at that time lived. While on the other hand, we have coal miners and going into the general strike at exactly the same time because they weren't paid enough to eat. These people, Philby, Burgess, McLean, Anthony Blunt, who's another very interesting person, decided to work for a change in that system. And we can see then how their beliefs then were enacted in actions of different kinds.
Klaus Fuchs, in a lot of ways, was a bit different than some of the other people that we've spoken about, and his background and what he actually did in his espionage career. Before we drill down into some of the specifics of his career, can you tell us a little bit about what did Klaus Fuchs actually do?
Well, what he did and why he's famous is that he took the detailed information about the atomic bomb that was developed at Los Alamos and sent it to Moscow. He perhaps accelerated the development of the Soviet atomic bomb by a year, maybe 2 years. As we look back at that time now, this becomes increasingly crucial. As the United States was planning a nuclear war against the Soviet Union to occur probably about 1950. The fact that the Soviets exploded a nuclear device in August 1949 made that impossible. The point at which this was most probable was during the Korean War, when the Chinese had intervened and had driven back the American and British forces to the Chinese-Korean border, from the Chinese-Korean border. And General MacArthur wanted to bomb the Chinese forces, and he was stopped from doing this. And it hasn't ever been much elaborated about why he was stopped. But one good reason that he was stopped was that President Truman and Eisenhower, who was head of the military at that time, thought that if the United States used atomic weapons there, the Soviets very likely do so themselves, perhaps by bombing London.
So who was Klaus Fuchs? What was his background? Where did he come from?
The background is very interesting. I see three approaches to Fuchs. One is the one we were just discussing, the espionage. And there's a lot of information about how he was caught and from the American and British side, and how he did what he did from the Soviet side. The second approach is that he was a physicist. He wasn't quite a Nobel Prize quality physicist. He was the next notch down, but he was very much admired for his work as a theoretical nuclear physicist. And the third approach to him is that he was a secular Protestant. His family had been, his father was a Protestant minister who became a Quaker. This was in Germany before the First World War. His grandfather had also been a Protestant minister. And Klaus Fuchs had drilled into him from an early age that it was very important to do the right thing, decide what was right, following, say, radical Protestant views and following the teachings of Immanuel Kant. And then once you've decided what the right thing to do is, to go ahead and do it, no matter what anybody else is saying. He took this essentially Christian idea with him as he became a communist before in the 1920s. His family had been social democrats, socialists, but he decided, and his siblings decided simultaneously, that the social democrats in Germany in the late 1920s weren't doing enough to stop the rise of the Nazi Party, and that the only group that seemed to be willing to actually fight, and I mean literally fight, street fights, the Nazis, was the German Communist Party. So you have these three things. You have the espionage, you have the physics, and you have this ethical approach to life. Fuchs started out his education at the Yale became a physics student, and as things deteriorated in Germany in the early 1930s, he took a leading role in the student branch of the German Communist Party and got into serious conflicts with the Nazis. I think here we need to talk about the difference between communism at that time and communism that we think of it as. The Communist Party in Germany was the largest in the world for quite some time and was an internationalist party. It thought that it would be a good thing if everybody in the world became communist. After Lenin brought the Russian Communist Party to power in what became the Soviet Union, there was a split. And some people decided that the thing to do was to build communism in the Soviet Union and forget about the rest of the world. And others wanted to continue the idea that there should be a worldwide revolution. The latter was Trotsky, and the former was Stalin, and Stalin won. But in the early 1930s, this wasn't completely clear. So Fuchs' allegiance to the Communist Party was an allegiance to the German Communist Party, not to the Soviet Union. It was only much later, after the German Communist Party was destroyed by the Nazis in the mid-1930s, that to be a communist meant that you had to have some kind of loyalty to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union.
How engaged was Fuchs? He was in the leadership of the German Communist Party. Was he on the more of the academic side of it, or was he actually in the trenches getting into these street fights with the Nazis and other sectarian groups?
He was in the trenches or in the streets, which was kind of strange. He was kind of a typical academic-looking person, rather thin, thick glasses, all that sort of thing. But he would go out in the streets and fight. Eventually, while he was at the University of Kiel in 1933, the local Nazi group decided that he was so dangerous that they were going to kill him. And his colleagues in the local communist group heard about this, and the Communist Party told him that he had to get out of Dodge. So he left Germany, went to Paris for a few weeks, made some friends there, which is interesting later, and then went to England. And in England, he enrolled in the University of Bristol, where he got a doctorate in nuclear physics.
It must have been interesting for the British at this point, because the communists are kind of the enemy of my enemy, but they're also, the communists are not exactly friendly to the British position. What kind of position did someone like Klaus Fuchs find himself in with the British? How much of a vetting process was there to what he was allowed to do, and how he would integrate into their society?
Well, he was fortunate in the way the British viewed the world. There's a difference in kinds of prejudices. In the United States, we have a particular prejudice against the descendants of enslaved Africans. In Britain, they don't have that kind of targeted prejudice. They're prejudiced against everybody who is not English or British in this case. So the fact that Fuchs had some kind of ideological commitment to the German Communist Party didn't concern them as much as the fact that he was a foreigner, he was a German. And as soon as they decided to accept the fact that he was a German immigrant, they didn't care very much about his background. And the information they were getting about him came from the Gestapo. And so the British authorities said, well, the Gestapo says he's a communist, but the Gestapo says everybody's a communist, so we'll just let him sit.
How did Fuchs continue his education in England?
Well, he went to the University of Bristol and he got his doctorate in nuclear physics there under Neville Mott. Nuclear physics at the time was a very small field. There used to be meetings, many of which were sponsored by Niels Bohr from Copenhagen, where practically all the significant nuclear physicists in the world would come to a meeting and be in a hall. So it was a small thing. And what they were doing was studying peculiarities about the way that substances existed. So they were tracing radiation because this was kind of weird. You had these substances that shot out neutrons and other oddities. The way to approach this was experiments that were done on a tabletop, literally on a tabletop, very small pieces of equipment. They would do an experiment, and then they would go off and they would think about it, and then they would do mathematical descriptions of it. There were no computers. And many of the leading mathematicians of that generation were very good at doing mathematics in their head, and Fuchs was outstanding about this. There's a story about a man who later became a friend of his, Richard Feynman. Somebody asked how Feynman solved high-level mathematical problems. And they were told, well, he writes it down on a piece of paper. He puts his hand to his forehead. He waits a couple of minutes, and then he writes down the answer. And that's kind of how Fuchs's mind worked. After he got his PhD, he went to Edinburgh, the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and he worked with Max Born. Max Born was one of the world's leading nuclear physicists. He was there as a Jewish refugee from Germany. As I said, Fuchs was not Jewish. Born's students included Teller, the father of the H-bomb, Pearls, who we'll hear much more about, Otto Frisch, who was one of the people who first noticed that there's possibility of nuclear fission, and some others. And Born thought that Fuchs was, after Heisenberg, was his star student.
That's interesting. He wasn't, you had mentioned that he wasn't quite at the cream of the crop of this core of nuclear scientists who are, I mean, if you rattle off their names, it's the who's who of science. Where did he kind of fall out as amongst these? I mean, it's kind of hard to, when you're on the all-star team, that you may not necessarily be at the top. As far as his physics career goes, was he an all-star or just not quite there?
Well, the all-stars, as you put it, always wanted him around to help. So when they would get into a situation where they couldn't quite figure out what to do about it, they would call Klaus Fuchs and say, well, what do you think about this? And he would work out an answer to that. The all-star business in science, as in many other places, is often a matter of politics and personalities as much as achievement. In any case, he was very, very good.
Where was Klaus Fuchs getting his connection to the communists at this point? Was it in the science community, or had he made connections elsewhere?
Well, that's very difficult. He didn't want to be brought to the attention of the British authorities. They might have overlooked the fact that he was in the German Communist Party, but they didn't, as you pointed out, they didn't really want to have communists rattling around in England. And he covered his tracks pretty well. And he apparently did make connections with communist cells in Edinburgh and elsewhere. And he knew how to do it if in case of need. The party, as I said earlier, had gotten him out of Germany and had gotten him to England. So he had some kind of good working connections there. But he was spending most of his time doing mathematics, mathematical physics. He wrote a paper when he was working with Max Born that is the basis for semiconductors, the mathematical basis for semiconductors, and thus for the world we live in. A few years ago, somebody counted it up, and they found that it had been cited 2,500 times as the basis for that kind of research. That took a lot of time for him to do. He wrote a number of papers with Max Born. So he was working on that sort of thing. In March 1940, Otto Frisch, who, as I said, had been one of the discoverers of fission, and Pearls wrote a paper where they said, there's this curious thing where if you shoot neutrons at uranium, it shoots more neutrons out than you shot in. And if you do this, you could blow up a city. And they sent this to the British government, and the British government said, oh, that's a good idea. Let's try to do that. And they set up what was called the Tube Allies Project. Also about that time, World War II had started, and the British government, acting on the kind of thought processes that I was talking about earlier, decided that all Germans in Great Britain were a threat, and they interned them. They put them in a prison camp on an island off England, and then they sent them to Quebec, to another prison, a rather difficult prison to live in. So Fuchs was picked up in this and spent some time in these prison camps that had this kind of dueling internal governance, where some of the prisoners were Nazis and they ran their part of the camp, and some of the prisoners were communists and they ran their other part of the camp. While he was there, Fuchs taught classes, helped run a newspaper, did that kind of thing. After a while, in June 1941, the British government realized that some of those people would have been useful who were in this prison camp in Quebec would be useful for the development of weapons, and they brought them back into Britain. Fuchs was one of those. He was brought back, worked some more with Bourne and with Pearls and Birmingham. This sometimes sounds like a tour of northern Britain. The paper that Pearls and Frisch had written had worked its way through the British bureaucracy. They had started this Tube Allies project. One of the problems with developing an atomic bomb is the material that you're using. It was true that uranium in its natural state was radioactive, but it wasn't very radioactive. One of its isotopes was much more radioactive and was suitable for making a bomb. And there was the issue of how you separate the very prevalent, not so useful version of uranium, which was well over 90%, and the very useful smaller amount, 235. Fuchs was put on this project, and he developed what was called gaseous diffusion. They would take the raw uranium and make it into a gas, uranium hexafluoride, and then force this gas through a filter. And since the different kinds of uranium had different weights, the heavier would go through after, lighter. And in this way, if you do this over and over and over and over and over again, you could separate the extremely radioactive uranium from the not so radioactive uranium. And Fuchs was central to that. I'm not quite sure he invented it, but he was central to that effort.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. And that's pretty much the absolute groundwork that was necessary in order to make uranium into a useful product.
Well, this was going on, and there were negotiations between the United States and Britain, 41, 42. And it was decided that there just wasn't enough room in Britain to do all the manufacturing that would be necessary to come up with an atomic bomb. And after some bureaucratic finagling going back and forth in the United States, President Roosevelt designated the Army as the group that would develop the atomic bomb. They started something called the Manhattan Project. And they put an Army colonel who said, if I'm going to do this, you have to promote me. So they made him a brigadier general. That was Leslie Groves at his head of it. This becomes important because what you have is the Army attitude towards life, which is someone gives orders, someone obeys the orders, that's that. Against the scientists who say, well, I think this may be true, but just because you say it's true doesn't mean it's true. I have to do some experiments. I'm going to talk to my buddies about this. This became a conflict with the Manhattan Project. In any case, it started going, and as part of the cooperation between the United States and Britain on this project, the British shipped over 30, something like 30, of their outstanding physicists to work with the Americans on it. And Fuchs was one of these. He first went to New York City, where there was a company called Kellex that had been set up to work on the atomic bomb. And then he was sent out to Los Alamos. When he was in New York City, he thought, we're talking about something like late 1943 here. He thought, well, the Soviet Union is fighting the Nazis, and they're in kind of a corner. And it would be very good if they knew what was going on with the atomic bomb, since they might be able to develop one of their own. There had been a treaty between Britain and the Soviet Union in May 1942, where they had mutually agreed to share all technology between themselves, between the two countries. So what Fuchs was saying was that he was going to operate in the same spirit as that. But he made contact with Soviet secret intelligence in New York. This implies that he had kept up his contacts with the Communist International and with the Soviet intelligence operations in England in such a way that he was able then to make contact with them in New York. He said, there's this big project going on. It's of interest to the Soviet Union. Here's dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of papers describing where we are, first with gaseous diffusion, but the state of the project in general. Then he went to Los Alamos, and he became one of the central people there. He was in the theory division, which was headed by Hans Bethe. The second one down was Pearls, who had been his kind of, older brother, might be a way of describing the relationship in England. And then working for Pearls was Fuchs. So he was one of the top three people in one of the central parts of Los Alamos. He had a very close relationship with Richard Feynman, who later won the Nobel Prize in physics. And Feynman's wife, a very young wife, was dying of tuberculosis. She was in a sanitarium in Albuquerque. And Fuchs got hold of a used car. And every week or two, he would drive Feynman out to the sanitarium. In any case, he drove him out of Los Alamos, south down to the city, so that Feynman could see his wife. On the way, from time to time, he would rendezvous with a Soviet courier in Santa Fe and say, well, here we are in Los Alamos, and this is what we're doing. We're trying to develop an atomic bomb. We have two ideas. One idea is to do it with uranium, and the other idea is to do it with plutonium. Plutonium is a product of a nuclear reactor. It's very difficult to work with. Well, as the project evolved in 1944, 1945, it was decided that plutonium was the way to go. To have an atomic bomb explode, but what you have to do is have a critical mass of the material. But you don't want to have a critical mass of the material before you want it to explode. So it's a matter of what do you do about this? What you do about it is that you have two chunks of it, and you put them together, if it's uranium. And they develop various ways of doing this. If it's plutonium, they first thought they would try to do that, but plutonium has a very short half-life, and it's just extremely dangerous stuff. So they developed the implosion method, where they made the plutonium into a sphere, and then they set up explosions around it so that the force of the explosions would impinge on the sphere equally all around it, compressing it to the point where it would explode. So the device that was done at Trinity, I believe, was the uranium device. The project was late. It was supposed to develop atomic bombs that could be dropped on Germany, but the Trinity test, the first test, took place in the summer of 45. The war was over in Europe. It had been clear earlier to everyone who was working that this was going to happen, that the bomb could not be used in Europe. It wouldn't be ready. That led to discussions. Well, what are we going to do about this? Should we stop working on it? Should we drop it on Japan? If we drop it on Japan, should we drop it on an uninhabited island? Or should we drop it on a city? General Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, was around a lot. He was a hands-on kind of manager. He was a general contractor, one might think. So there was a dinner party sometime when they were going through this process, where he said, well, it doesn't matter because we're developing this to drop on the Soviets. At that point, some of the scientists left. They said, we didn't sign on to have a nuclear war against the Soviet Union. Whether or not they weren't communists, they just didn't think that was a good idea. Some of them left because they thought having an atomic bomb was not a good idea. Fuchs heard about this and said, oh, well, I was right. I should continue giving the Soviet information. Those who were thought to have especially valuable information and skills stayed. One of those was Klaus Fuchs, who was asked by the American government to stay. He was working at the time with Teller, who was developing ideas for the hydrogen bomb. And the basic, what's called the classic hydrogen bomb plan pattern was developed by Ulam and Teller and Fuchs. So Fuchs knew everything about the early history of the hydrogen bomb, as well as being able to provide like blueprints on how you build an atomic bomb. He stayed in the United States till 46 and was there for the Bikini Atoll test and had some contribution to that. It's not quite clear to me what that was. Oppenheimer, who had run Los Alamos, if you know that, asked him to stay in the United States and go with Oppenheimer to Princeton, to the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. And Fuchs said, no, I'm going back to England. So he went back to England. The Brits decided that they wanted to have their own atomic bomb. This was portrayed as being, we want to have nuclear reactors to have good carbon neutral power. But no, they wanted to develop an atomic bomb. They thought that if they had an atomic bomb, they would remain as a great power. This idea was originally Churchill's. He wanted to bomb anybody around. But he lost the British election in the summer of 45, and Clement Attlee became prime minister. And Clement Attlee was a socialist and anti-imperialist. He's the person who made sure that India became independent. He kept telling his colleagues that there was no reason to have an empire. It was a money-losing proposition in any case. He wanted to have all that money that was being spent on the empire and spent on the military to spend on socialized medicine and things like that, which they did. And an atomic bomb is cheaper than a large army. So the Brits decided they wanted to develop an atomic bomb and have a whole nuclear development project. They set up a place, the center at a place called Harwell, which is more or less near Oxford. And it was the equivalent of Los Alamos. And they made Fuchs head of the theoretical nuclear division, physics division of this, where he and his colleagues, they were working on developing nuclear reactors to generate the plutonium that they would need to have an atomic bomb and other kinds of experiments. As he was back in England, and it was very clear to him now what was going on with the conflicts between the British and Americans on the one side and the Soviets on the other. He did this extraordinary thing. He had lost his contacts with the Soviet intelligence system because he had been in America, came back to England. He had information that he wanted to send to the Soviet Union. So he walked into the Soviet embassy in London said, "Hi, I'm Klaus Fuchs. I have some top secret information to give to you." This caused absolute panic in the Soviet embassy. They went running around. Eventually, a person there who had some title that didn't matter, but was the representative of the Soviet intelligence system, a man named Kremer, said, okay, we'll set you up. And they encouraged him to go to Jürgen Kaczynski, who was a sociologist. He was working for the American occupation, the American forces in Britain for a while. He's very well known. He was a communist, but he wasn't in the party, and he was connected to intelligence and so forth. So Fuchs talked to him, and he said, well, I want you to meet somebody who can help you do this. And he introduced Fuchs to his sister, who is called Sonia. She was named Ursula. She was called Sonia. And she became the conduit for Fuchs sending information about the atomic bomb to the Soviets, and also, it seems, information about the hydrogen bomb.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
The Soviet scientists who were developing the atomic bomb would give questions about about their efforts. You know, do we solder the blue wire or the red wire here? To people who would then give them to the Soviet secret intelligence system, who would send them to London, who would give them to Sonia, who would give them to Fuchs. Fuchs would say the red wire, and then she would send it back, and then they would do that. So the way this worked out was that whenever there was a decision to be made about how to go forward with the atomic bomb project, they would ask Fuchs about which way should we go, and he would say, you should go that way. And because of the nature of the questions they were asking, he could tell how much progress they were making. Eventually, he said, oh, you're getting really close, aren't you? And then he answered the last few questions, and on August 29th, 1949, they exploded a nuclear device. At which point, he could have just stopped. But as it happened, in the United States, the FBI had been on the Rosenberg case, and they had found the Rosenbergs, the two Rosenberg couple, had been communicating with Soviet intelligence through a courier, an American named Harry Gold. They got Gold, and they said, okay, why don't you tell us everything? And if you tell us everything, we'll treat you okay. Yeah. Were you working with anybody else? And he said, no, I wasn't working with anybody else. I said, did you have anything to do with Los Alamos? He said, I never been to New Mexico. They searched his apartment, and they found the map of Santa Fe that Fuchs had given Gold for the rendezvous. And they said, why do you have this map if you've never been to New Mexico? He said, I confess, I was the courier for Klaus Fuchs. So Klaus Fuchs was arrested. There was a kind of entanglement there. They didn't have the British police, the special branch, or their equivalent, the FBI, didn't have any information they could use in court, because a lot of this had come from the Venona project, the deciphering of Soviet communications during the war, and that was incredibly secret. They had to make Fuchs confess. They did this by being very friendly with him and saying, well, are you sure you did the right thing? This is a great burden, isn't it? And they kept calling him up and bringing him downtown and watching him and watching everybody he talked to. He felt that he was becoming a problem for his friends, that they would say, his friends were his other physicists and their families, would say, no, Klaus Fuchs is a good guy. He couldn't possibly, we'll testify to how he's a good guy, and he couldn't possibly have done this. And Fuchs decided that he couldn't let them do that, that would be something that wasn't right. So he confessed. He said, yeah, I did it. He was tried. The trial went on for like an hour and a half. And he thought that he was going to be shot, but it turned out that the treason didn't apply because the Soviet Union was not at war with the British Empire. What he was convicted of was violations of the Official Secrets Act, which he had signed, and he had said, "I'll never give away secrets," and then he gave away secrets, so he was guilty. He was sentenced to 14 years in jail. An aspect of this that I'm completely unsure about is that he was head of the theoretical physics branch at Harvard. He was the key person or one of, I don't want to argue, say one of three key people in the British nuclear development program. For the Brits to take him out of that and put him in jail was self-harm. I guess, I have no real evidence here, but I guess that as he accelerated the Soviet program by a year, his arrest probably delayed the British program for a year. So he goes to jail. And in jail, he becomes kind of popular. The other prisoners decide that he's an honest man, and so he becomes kind of their banker. They give him their money to watch. He adjudicates conflicts. He gives lectures on beginning physics and other things. He doesn't have a good time. You don't have a good time in jail, but he had a tolerable existence there. Gradually, people visited him. The FBI visited him. Pearls and other physicists visited him. I have a feeling, I don't have a record evidence of this, that the British nuclear physicists working on the development of their bomb and their reactors had the same kind of relationship with him as the Soviets did. That when they got into a problem, said, should I use this formula or that formula to figure out where to go? They would visit the jail. They would talk to him. The wardens would sit there listening to these physicists talking about their formula and nod wisely. And that's how it went. He had been sentenced to 14 years in prison. He got out with good behavior in 9 years. The FBI wanted him to be shipped to the United States and tried again, but the British said, no, we have some sense of dignity. And they put him on a plane. He said, where do you want to go? Thinking he would want to go to Moscow. He said, no, I don't want to go to Moscow. I want to go to Berlin. I want to go home. So they flew him home to Berlin, where he had a hero's welcome. And specifically, he was met by a woman, Greta, who he had met in Paris when the party had extracted him from Germany and sent him off through Paris to England. So he hadn't seen her since 1934, and they got married in Berlin in 1959. The authorities in the German Democratic Republic, which we call East Germany, thought he was a great guy, and they made him assistant head of their nuclear development program, which was working to develop reactor. He had all kinds of honors there. He had a nice house. He had a chauffeur, cars. He was made a member of the Central Committee of the party, which ironically enough was the United Socialist Communist Party, the union between the socialists and the communists that had failed to occur in 1933, and which might have stopped the Nazis, was the official name, although of course it was just a communist party, of the German ruling party. His father was still alive when he got back there, so there was a reunion with his father, and his father said, I'm glad that you followed your conscience. There's a very interesting memoir by his nephew, who's called Klaus Fuchs, called Klaus Fuchs and the Humanist Task of Science. And it's about the ethical demands of the scientists and what Fuchs' life meant in terms of making ethical choices in difficult times. So that leaves us with that issue. What would you do?
I mean, I think that is ultimately the question that I kept coming back with Klaus Fuchs' story is, in a way, he wasn't necessarily a bad guy. He was doing, it really wasn't subterfuge. It wasn't like he was shirking on his duties. to the British and to the Americans at the Los Alamos Project. He did everything that he was going to do. He didn't in any way put up any sort of roadblocks to hurting the US or Britain. He just was also helping the Soviets at the same time. I mean, it's an interesting dilemma to try and assess him.
It's a dilemma that I think many people continue to have, not about him, but about decisions you make. That if you're working for an organization or a government that's doing things that you think are wrong, what do you do? Is your personal conscience something that is more important than your loyalty to your city, your church, your country? Where do you stand on these things?
And I think one question that I had, and I wonder if there was any information about this. Why didn't Fuchs just quit and go work for the Soviets and help them directly instead of continuing? Because to me, that's sort of maybe the part of the story that is a little underhanded. He could have, if he did have such a conscience that he wanted to help the Soviets, why not just go work for them and help them with their program directly?
Well, for one thing, he wasn't a Soviet communist, right? He was a German communist. And he never thought that he wanted to live in the Soviet Union. That's just a personal kind of thing. I don't know how he would have done that. What year are we talking about? Are we talking about 1941? Where it's impossible from 41 to 45, it would be impossible for civilians to travel to the Soviet Union. And if he did, they would, given Stalin,
yeah,
they would have said, "Who are you? You're obviously a British spy. We're going to send you to the Gulag if you're lucky." It just wasn't on the cards.
I think it's interesting that somebody like him who clearly has so many communist connections, and in a lot of ways, he wasn't the only one who you might say was problematic with amongst academics who had left leanings and a spectrum of left leanings. What were the security procedures at places like Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project and then the project in England? You would think that those would be the sort of things that would be very buttoned up security wise. How was somebody like Fuchs able to get so much information out?
Well, the Manhattan Project was extremely security conscious. Groves was extremely security conscious. They were always looking for spies everywhere. And there was barbed wire around the laboratory and then barbed wire around the town and lots of passes going back and forth. It was very, very tight. The issue was these 30 scientists, say 30 scientists from Britain who had been sent there. And there was an understanding that the British had taken care of the vetting of these people. So there wasn't an American vetting of them. And the Brits, as I said, had decided that Fuchs and the others were so valuable as physicists that they would overlook things such as the fact that they were communists.
I think it's fascinating that he's so much more particularly interesting, I think, trying to get into his mind of an academic, and you have to get in your mind of an academic, but also of somebody who's a political true believer. It's very complicated.
There is a parallel, by the way. One of the Cambridge spies, Donald MacLeod, came out of that same group as Philby and so forth. He was a diplomat, and he got very high up in the British diplomatic service and gave away everything that the Brits and the Americans were working on. He was eventually on the committee that decided policy for nuclear weapons in the Anglo-American Policy Act. And also he was part of the planning, or he was aware of the planning for the Anglo-American possibility of nuclear war against the Soviet Union. He had a nervous breakdown eventually. He couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand the fact that everyone thought that he was this wonderful loyal British diplomat, while on the other hand, he was giving away all the secrets. And he had a nervous breakdown. And the party, Communist Party, decided that he couldn't be left in place, that he had to be taken out. So he was taken to Moscow in 1951. And eventually, after they dried him out, he was an alcoholic like everybody else. I think Fuchs is the only person I've ever studied who wasn't an alcoholic. Donald MacLeod was dried out, learned Russian, was put in a think tank in Moscow that specialized in international relations, and became a professor, more or less, and an advisor to the Soviet Union's foreign office, and had a good career in that place. He wrote a book called British Foreign Policy Since Suez. That's a very good account of those things. He had many loyal students. I interviewed one when I was working on his biography. So he was able to establish a new life in the Soviet Union. So that was possible. That was possible. Fuchs was German. He didn't want to do it.
Trying to get into the head of someone who's playing both sides of a conflict, and who undercover cops, undercover agents, people who have to pretend that they're being helpful to the one side that they're really trying to harm. But I get the feeling, and maybe I'm incorrect here, I don't get the sense that Fuchs necessarily thought that way, that he's not the classic undercover agent.
No, I think you're right. Philby was. As I mentioned the other day, Philby was a sociopath. He really liked fooling people. And then layered on top of that, he said he was a loyal communist. Fuchs didn't like it. MacLeod didn't like it. But they felt they had to do it. They made that decision, and then they lived with it.